peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which the US helped to broker. Here he is announcing it.
After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board and on a broad range of areas, including tourism, education, healthcare, trade, and security.
Only two Arab nations, Egypt and Jordan, have previously signed peace deals with Israel. Let's hear from Israel's Prime Minister.
This is the greatest advancements toward peace between Israel and the Arab world in the last 26 years, and it marks the third formal peace between Israel and an Arab nation.
Some reaction now from around the world. The Palestinian authorities have rejected the deal and called for a meeting of the Arab League. A senior Palestinian official, Hanan Ashrawi, said the UAE has come out into the open on its secret dealings with Israel. Please don't do us a favour, she says. We are nobody's fig leaf. But UAE's ambassador to the United States called this a win for diplomacy and for the region that lowers tensions and creates new energy for positive change. The Iranian Tasnim news agency, which is affiliated to the Revolutionary Guards, unsurprisingly condemns the move, saying the UAE-Israel agreement is shameful. And here's the response from the United Nations. UN Chief Guterres welcomes any initiative that can promote peace and security in the Middle East region. White House officials say that as part of the agreement, Israel has agreed to suspend applying sovereignty to parts of the occupied West Bank that it had considered annexing. Diana Boutou is a lawyer and she's a former legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization. We asked her about this.
Look, I think it's important to keep in mind that there have been two processes of annexation, the formal one and the informal process. The informal process has gone on for 53 years, and that has included the confiscation of Palestinian land, the theft of Palestinian land, building of Israeli-only infrastructure on that land, creation of an apartheid system, and denial of freedom to Palestinians. The formal annexation was the part that was supposed to happen in July, and that's the only part that's going to be stopped. But I can guarantee you that tomorrow there will be more settlements that will be built. There will remain an apartheid system in place. Palestinians will be denied freedom, and we will forever be living under a system of in which we are denied our basic human rights.
Barbara Pletasher joins us from Washington. Barbara, why has this happened now?
Well, you know, Philippa, Israel has been improving ties with Gulf Arab states quietly for some time now because they see a shared threat from Iran. And U.S. officials have said that over the past year and a half, the UAE and Israel had been discussing about how they might go public with that, with improving relations. But then what happened is that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu started to talk about annexing parts of the occupied West Bank that Palestinians want for a state, and the UAE came out and made clear that that was a red line. There was a very direct intervention by the U.S. ambassador to the UAE in June, in which he said directly to the Israelis, if you go ahead with this, this is going to jeopardize any relations you want with the Arab countries. And after that, U.S. officials said they came up with this idea of framing the agreement like this, suspending the plans for annexation in exchange for normalization. So that's why you see this happening today.
And yet the anger from Palestinians is very clear.
It is, for a number of reasons, Philippa. One is that this upends the collective regional arrangement for peace. So since the Jordan Peace Treaty in 1994, there's been an agreement that there wouldn't be any further normalization until there was peace with the Palestinians and until they had an independent state. And they don't have that, and yet the UAE has gone ahead with this agreement. So the Palestinians feel angry, betrayed, stabbed in the back, that sort of thing. Now, the UAE has been very careful to frame this in terms of Palestinian rights. It says it has made this agreement in order to stop annexation and that it will continue to push for an independent state. But as you were hearing there from Diana Boutou, that's kind of an empty promise as far as the Palestinians are concerned, because according to the terms of the Trump peace vision, what the terms are that this would cement Israel's control over large parts of the West Bank, and it would basically keep the Palestinians in their disconnected enclaves, and so they have already rejected that as well.
A brief thought, Barbara, about what this does for US influence in the region.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, what it does is it reflects how much influence the U.S. has with its two closest allies, which are the UAE and Israel. And it is very supportive of more agreements like this between Israel and Arab states. And it has said that there will be others and that they will work towards that. In fact, Jared Kushner, the president's advisor, said some countries were sorry they hadn't been able to be first. So we'll see if that happens. I think that will depend to some extent on how this agreement works out. It's interesting because already there have been different emphases. Mr. Netanyahu has said that basically he agreed to President Trump's request to temporarily wait with the annexation, what he calls extending sovereignty, whereas the Emirati foreign minister has said, no, we understand this to be a stoppage, not a suspension, and we don't expect the Israelis to change their mind. So we'll see how it plays out.
Barbara, thanks very much. BBC World Service Middle East editor Sebastian Usher is following this. Sebastian, is it unexpected?
Unexpected, no. Surprised the way that it suddenly appeared, yes. I mean, not unexpected in the sense that just as you were hearing there about the situation in the Palestinian territories, essentially contrast between the formal and the informal, but essentially there's a status quo either way. There's a sort of status quo that's established itself between the UAE and Israel, and to be honest, between Israel and several other Gulf Arab states in the past few years. It's been covert, the warming up of relations much of the time, but recently it's come more out into the open. Coronavirus has been one of those examples where both countries have talked about working together to deal with coronavirus. The UAE sent a plane which went directly, a flight direct, to Israel to help with the Palestinians there. So it's a surprise in that it has suddenly sprung apparently out of nowhere, although we've been hearing from the White House, from the Americans, from Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, who's the man put in charge of Middle East matters, that these negotiations towards this have been going on for a year and a half. I think from the UAE's perspective, they saw an opportunity to make this something where they can come out of it well, in terms perhaps of domestic opinion and even Arab opinion. When the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the last Israeli election promised that he would launch the process towards annexation of up to 30% of the occupied West Bank, that became obviously a rallying cry again. It hasn't been for some time, the Palestinian issue, for much of the Arab world. So the UAE has been it sounded a slightly different note from Israel and the US in this. Israel and the US have talked about a historic breakthrough. They've talked about a peace deal. They've talked about it in the ranks of the Egyptian and the Jordanian peace deals. What the UAE has essentially been saying is this is a step forward. It is good for peace. It is good for bringing countries together. But the absolute key element it's talking about is that from the UAE's perspective, it stopped the threat of annexation. And they're saying not just for now, but completely. That's not the message, though, that's coming from Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, in the speech that he made when he was asking questions afterwards, said that annexation has been delayed but not cancelled.